The young pilot climbed into his SE-5A fighter on a grey morning in March 1917, fastening his leather helmet and adjusting his goggles. He carried a revolver, flare pistol, maps, and a small survival kit. What he didn't carry, what no Royal Flying Corps pilot carried into combat over the Western Front, was a parachute. This wasn't an oversight, it was policy. Whilst German aviators across no man's land flew with high-necker parachute packs that could save their lives if their aircraft caught fire, British and Commonwealth pilots had been explicitly denied this equipment. The decision wasn't made by engineers who doubted the technology. It came from the top of the command structure, from men who had never flown in combat themselves, but who had developed a peculiar philosophy about what constituted acceptable risk. The Royal Flying Corps, which would become the Royal Aeronautic Force in April 1918, operated under a doctrine that seems incomprehensible today. Senior officers genuinely believed that providing parachutes would undermine fighting spirit. Major General Hugh Trenchard, commander of the RFC in France, subscribed to the view that pilots equipped with an escape option might abandon their aircraft prematurely during combat. The logic followed that a pilot fighting to save both himself and his aeroplane would press home attacks more aggressively than one who could simply bail out when things turned dangerous. This wasn't merely theoretical prejudice, it was codified policy. When parachute manufacturers approached the War Office with working designs as early as 1914, they were rebuffed. The official stance held that parachutes were suitable for balloon observers, those stationary spotters tethered above the trenches, but inappropriate for aeroplane pilots. Balloon observers received parachutes because they couldn't maneuver away from danger. Their hydrogen-filled observation balloons were sitting targets for incendiary rounds. When attacked, they had no choice but to jump. Pilots, however, could theoretically fly away from trouble, or so the reasoning went. The cultural dimension ran deeper than tactics. Aviation in the Great War retained elements of chivalric mythology, a romantic notion of aerial duelling that bore little resemblance to the brutal reality. Some officers feared that parachutes would transform fighter pilots into something less admirable, men who would flee rather than fight. There existed an unspoken class assumption as well. Balloon observers were often drawn from different social backgrounds than commissioned pilots, and some historians have suggested that the hierarchy viewed pilots as gentlemen who shouldn't need an escape mechanism because their honour demanded they go down with their machines. Meanwhile, the aircraft themselves were appallingly vulnerable. The SE-5A, Sopwith Camel, and other British fighters were constructed from wood, fabric, and highly flammable dope that waterproofed the canvas. Fuel tanks sat just forward of the cockpit with minimal protection. Tracer and incendiary ammunition turned these machines into airborne coffins when struck. A single bullet in the right place could ignite a fuel line, and the resulting fire would engulf the cockpit within seconds. Pilots called these fires flaming, or going down in flames, a death so horrific that many aviators carried revolvers not for combat but to shoot themselves rather than burn alive. The fall itself offered its own terror. From 15,000 feet, a pilot had roughly a minute to contemplate his death as the ground rushed upward. Some men jumped deliberately to avoid burning, choosing the certainty of impact over immolation. Others rode their stricken aircraft down, either trapped by G-forces in a spin or desperately trying to control a dying machine. The psychological toll was extraordinary. Pilots developed what was then called flyer's heart or neurasthenia, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety conditions. Knowing that every sortie might end in an unpreventable death, wore men down faster than combat itself. The official justifications for the parachute ban formed a carefully constructed argument that prioritized machinery over men. Air Vice Marshal Sir Sefton Branca, who served as Deputy Director of Military Aeronautics, articulated the core reasoning in internal memoranda that would later prove deeply embarrassing. The concern wasn't merely that pilots might jump too readily, it was that they might abandon salvageable aircraft, wasting valuable military assets. Each fighter represented thousands of pounds of investment and hundreds of labour hours. A pilot, by contrast, could be replaced with another volunteer from the training schools in England within weeks. This calculus revealed something uncomfortable about how the military hierarchy valued human life versus equipment. An SE-5A cost approximately $2,000 to manufacture in 1917, equivalent to roughly $150,000 today, when adjusted for inflation and relative economic value. Training a replacement pilot cost considerably less, though calculating the exact figure proves difficult because training programs varied widely in length and intensity. What the accounts couldn't capture was experience. A veteran pilot with 20 combat sorties possessed skills and situational awareness that no amount of training could replicate quickly. Yet the official position treated pilots as more expendable than their aeroplanes. Trenchard's memos to the War Office made the strategic concern explicit. He argued that pilots under fire might opt for the parachute rather than attempting emergency landings that could preserve the aircraft for recovery and repair. This wasn't entirely without merit. Damaged aircraft that made it back across friendly lines could be salvaged for parts or rebuilt. An aeroplane abandoned over enemy territory was a total loss, and one abandoned over friendly territory still had to be located and transported, often under difficult conditions. The French Air Service, which did provide parachutes to some units, had indeed recorded instances where pilots bailed out of aircraft that investigation teams later determined might have been flyable. But the mathematics didn't support the policy when examined honestly. The percentage of aircraft that could be saved through forced landings versus those destroyed in crashes was marginal. Most battle damage severe enough to make a pilot consider abandoning his aircraft was already catastrophic. Engine failure from enemy fire, structural damage to wings or control surfaces, or fuel system fires rarely left aircraft in repairable condition, regardless of whether the pilot attempted a landing. The salvage argument appeared stronger on paper than in practice. There was another dimension to the official logic: the deterrent effect on reckless behaviour. Some staff officers believed that removing the safety net would make pilots more cautious in their tactical decisions, more thoughtful about when to break off combat or avoid unnecessary risks. This theory contradicted the other claim that pilots would fight more aggressively without parachutes, revealing the confused thinking at the heart of the policy. In practice, it achieved neither goal. Pilots didn't become more cautious, they became fatalistic. Squadron diaries and personal letters reveal men who viewed their survival as purely random chance, not something they could influence through skill or judgment. The institutional resistance also stemmed from simple bureaucratic inertia and pride. Once the RFC had publicly stated its position on parachutes, reversing course would constitute an admission of error that had cost lives. The longer the policy remained in effect, the more difficult it became to change without triggering uncomfortable questions about accountability. Officers who had championed the ban would face implicit criticism, and families of dead pilots might demand explanations for why their sons had been denied safety equipment that existed and functioned. Financial considerations played a subtler role. Equipping every pilot with a parachute represented an additional expense in a war already consuming resources at an unprecedented rate. Each parachute required silk, harnesses, containers, and regular inspection and repacking. Multiplied across hundreds of pilots, the cost became significant, Yet compared to the expense of aircraft production and fuel consumption, parachutes represented a trivial investment. A Guardian Angel parachute cost approximately 30 isund, barely 1% of an aircraft's value. The economic argument never truly held water, but it provided convenient cover for other motivations. The cultural factor remained paramount. British military culture in 1917 still carried Victorian assumptions about courage, duty, and the proper conduct of officers and gentlemen. Ernst Udet climbed from his burning Albatross fighter on 29th of June 1918, pulling the ripcord of his Heinecker parachute as flames consumed the cockpit he'd occupied seconds earlier. The canopy deployed, the harness jerked tight, and he descended safely into German-held territory. Within hours he was debriefed, examined by medical staff, and cleared to return to duty. 3 days later, he was flying combat missions again. Udet would survive the war with 62 confirmed victories, becoming Germany's second highest scoring surviving ace. His British counterparts enjoyed no such second chances. The Luftstreitkräfte, Germany's air service, had begun issuing parachutes to fighter pilots in 1918, though the technology had been available earlier. German observation balloon crews had used parachutes since 1916, and the designs proved so reliable that the military command saw no reason to withhold them from aeroplane pilots. The Heinecker parachute, developed by Otto Heinecker, consisted of a seat-type pack worn by the pilot that deployed when he jumped clear of his aircraft. It wasn't perfect. The bulky pack made cockpits more cramped and added weight, but it worked consistently enough that German pilots trusted their lives to it. This technological advantage created an asymmetrical battlefield that extended beyond mere survival statistics. German pilots could afford to take certain tactical risks that would prove suicidal for their British opponents. When engaged by superior numbers or caught in a deteriorating tactical position, a German pilot knew he possessed an exit strategy. He could commit to aggressive maneuvers, press attacks closer to the edge of his aircraft's performance envelope, and generally fly with a psychological freedom that British pilots lacked. If his aircraft suffered critical damage or caught fire, he wouldn't burn or fall to his death. He would float down under silk canopy and fight another day. The intelligence reports flowing back to British headquarters documented this disparity. RFC pilots who witnessed German aviators parachuting from stricken aircraft reported these incidents in their combat narratives. Wing commanders compiled the accounts, noting the frequency with which German pilots survived encounters that would have killed their British counterparts. By mid-1918, captured German pilots openly discussed their parachutes during interrogation, expressing genuine bewilderment that the British didn't provide similar equipment. Some claimed they wouldn't fly without one, couldn't comprehend why anyone would. The survival advantage compounded over time. Experienced German pilots who would have died in early combats instead returned to their squadrons, accumulating skills and tactical knowledge. Each subsequent mission made them more dangerous opponents. The average British pilot arriving at a frontline squadron in 1918 had perhaps 20 hours of flying experience and minimal gunnery training. He faced German veterans who had survived dozens of combats, who knew every trick and maneuver, whose muscle memory had been honed through repetition that should have killed them but didn't, because parachutes gave them multiple lives. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron himself, flew without a parachute for most of his career and died in April 1918 before widespread parachute adoption in German fighter units. One wonders how history might have differed had he survived being shot down, to return and continue his domination of the skies. Other German aces weren't so unfortunate. Multiple Luftstreitkräfte pilots survived parachute escapes during 1918 and went on to add to their victory tallies. directly killing British pilots who lacked the same escape option. The morale impact was devastating. British pilots knew their enemies possessed technology denied to them. They understood that the disparity had nothing to do with engineering capability. Britain's industrial capacity certainly could produce parachutes, but resulted from decisions made by staff officers far from the front. Letters home and diary entries from this period reveal bitter resentment. Pilots felt expendable, sacrificed to theories about fighting spirit that seemed increasingly hollow when measured against the reality of watching German pilots safely descend from aircraft identical to the burning wrecks that killed their British friends. French aviation units presented a mixed picture. The French military had experimented with various parachute designs and issued them selectively, though not universally. Some elite squadrons received them while others didn't, creating internal disparities that the French command seemed more willing to tolerate than their British counterparts. Major Christopher Draper burned to death on 17th May 1917 when his Bristol fighter caught fire during a dogfight over Cambrai. His observer, Lieutenant Harold Satchell, died beside him. The aircraft fell 4,000 feet, and witnesses on the ground reported that both men were still alive during the descent, trapped in the flames. Draper had been a vocal advocate for parachutes, having written to his commanding officer 3 weeks earlier requesting that the RFC reconsider its policy. His death was neither unusual nor particularly noteworthy by the grim standards of 1917. What made it significant was that his family had connections in Parliament. Lord Sydenham raised the parachute question in the House of Lords on 16th July 1917, specifically mentioning Draper's death and demanding an explanation for why British pilots lacked equipment that could have saved his life. The Air Board's response, delivered by Lord Cowdray, repeated the official justifications about aircraft preservation and fighting spirit. The exchange might have ended there, dismissed as another aristocratic family seeking special consideration, except that other members of Parliament had begun receiving similar letters from constituents whose sons had died in burning aircraft. The political pressure was building, slowly but undeniably. Captain James McCudden, who would become one of Britain's highest-scoring aces, with 57 victories before his death in July 1918, documented his frustration in letters that were published after the war. He described watching